The silence at the funeral was heavy, muffled by the weight of grief and longing. Joao's friends and family were gathered there to pay their last respects to a man who had been the center of so many people's lives. But deep down, something seemed wrong. The priest, a usually solid, unflappable figure, was visibly uncomfortable. His words trembled when he referred to the deceased, and his posture seemed rigid, as if he were trying to hold back something that wanted to escape. The priest's hands were sweaty, and he constantly looked at the coffin with a restlessness that no one seemed to notice, but which was becoming impossible to ignore. Why was he acting like that? What was going through his head? Something didn't fit. Among those present, a doubt began to spread, like an invisible current. John's death had been unexpected, but not a great shock. He was an old man, and his health had deteriorated over the years. But Max, his faithful dog, had died a few weeks earlier, and no one understood exactly what had happened between the time of Max's death and John's funeral. There was something in the air, something that seemed incomplete. And there, at the back of the church, Max's bark echoed, abruptly breaking the mourning. It wasn't possible. The sound seemed to come from inside the coffin. But how could that be? There was no point. Max's memory was intact in everyone's mind, but the dog was gone. The last few weeks of Max's life had been marked by the fragility of his health. John then made a decision that no one would have imagined. He didn't want to say goodbye to his best friend. He didn't want to leave Max behind, and perhaps he didn't even have the strength to do so. The pain of losing the dog had been unbearable, but what Joao hadn't told anyone was that, before he died, Max hadn't just been buried in his garden, as everyone had thought. He had something else planned. Something that nobody knew about. John wasn't willing to let Max be just another memory, just another part of a painful past. He couldn't. He couldn't deal with the idea of moving on without him. Max had always been by his side, and the moment the dog died, a part of John was gone too. But the loss of Max was not something he could accept. Something pushed him to find a way to maintain the bond, to keep the dog with him. The pain of losing such a loyal and constant friend was more than John could bear. So what he did was unthinkable. He did something so risky that no one would ever have imagined it. He made a decision that would defy any logical explanation, something that would break the norms, defy even the limits of human understanding. He decided that Max somehow had to be with him until the end. So in the silence of his home, surrounded by the loneliness of his own pain, he brought Max into his life in a way that few could understand. And what no one knew was that this decision would change the nature of John's funeral forever. What was happening there, at that moment, was only the beginning of something that would surpass everyone's understanding. And no one, not even the priest, was prepared for what would happen next. That Sunday morning, the church was full. The wooden chairs creaked under the weight of people's silent anguish. The sound of a sermon that should have been consoling seemed instead to add to the discomfort in the air. The priest tried to follow his routine, but his mind was far away, occupied with thoughts he could no longer ignore. All eyes were on John's coffin, and no one knew that it carried with it a secret so deep that it was about to come to light in a way that no one could ever have imagined. At the back of the church, between the pews, an old friend of John's, Francisco, watched carefully. He knew about the unique bond between John and Max, and something about the priest's behavior was bothering him deeply. That nervousness wasn't normal. It was more than just concern about the event. He seemed apprehensive, almost guilty. Francisco tried to concentrate, but the memory of what John had done before he died haunted him. For weeks, no one had known that Max the dog wasn't just buried in the garden of the house. At that moment, Francisco remembered the last conversation he'd had with John a few days before his death. John was weak, but there was a sparkle in his eyes, a sparkle that Francis couldn't fully understand at the time. Max had always been more than just a dog to John. He was an extension of his own soul. But when Max died, the hole left behind was too big to fill. John no longer knew what to do with himself. The emptiness that Max had left behind was unbearable. It was then that Francisco began to realize what was happening. Joao couldn't accept Max's death in the conventional way, not just because of his grief, but because of a deep-rooted belief in him, the belief that the loyalty between him and Max would transcend even death. In those weeks, John made a radical decision. He would not allow Max's body to be taken far away, to a simple grave in the countryside. No, that wasn't enough. John knew there was a way that no one else could understand, but that somehow seemed right to him. One silent night, without anyone knowing, he exhumed Max's body and did something that society would call crazy. He had prepared a special grave right next to where he himself would be buried. Max, his faithful friend, would have a final farewell that aligned with the promise he had made to himself, never to part, no matter what the cost, no matter how everyone reacted or what they thought of him. The love between the two of them was greater than anything else. The priest, for his part, knew this. He knew that John had done something unthinkable, but he never thought the secret would be so disturbing. During the ceremony, he felt everyone's eyes fixed on him, but his mind was no longer focused on the words he needed to say. In his mind, he relived the night before, when, on arriving to give John's body its final blessing, he noticed something strange. Max, the dog, was there, next to the coffin, as if waiting for something. The priest tried to ignore it. The scene didn't make sense. How could this be possible? But the barking, sharp and urgent, was already beginning to infiltrate the minds of those present, and the feeling of something very wrong was spreading like wildfire. The priest looked at the coffin once more, his breathing becoming shorter. He knew that, inside that coffin, there wasn't just John. Something else was there, something that should be left in the past, but which, for some reason, was being brought back. What no one knew, what no one could have predicted, was that this simple farewell ceremony would not just be a goodbye, but the start of something much deeper, something that would only be revealed when John's last secret came to light. The priest looked at the coffin once more, his heart racing. He felt that, somehow, the key to understanding what was happening was there, at that moment, in that room full of people who would never imagine what was about to happen. The barking continued, louder, clearer, as if it were calling out to someone. And nobody knew it yet, but what was about to happen would be an inevitable outcome. Something had to be done, and perhaps the priest was the only one who still had the chance to understand what John had somehow done. He had to act before it was too late. The barking, which before had seemed distant and almost like an illusion, now became unmistakable. It was a clear, imposing sound that could not be ignored. The priest, pale as a leaf, looked once more at John's coffin. His eyes were dilated with fear, and sweat dripped down his forehead. The sound intensified, filling the silence of the church in a way that nothing could drown out. He knew somehow that it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a trick of his mind. The restlessness he felt was not a normal reaction to grief. He was facing something much deeper, something that defied all the laws of logic, nature, and faith. The priest felt a mixture of anger and disbelief as he realized that what he was witnessing could not be explained in any way. What else could he do? The ceremony, which had begun so calmly, was now turning into a nightmare. Francisco, who until then had been watching in silence, began to understand what was happening. The barking was coming from inside the coffin, getting louder and louder, as if Max the dog was really there, responding to John's call. What, until then, had seemed impossible, now seemed to be becoming an undeniable reality. Francisco knew, deep down in his heart, that John had done something irreversible. But he had no idea how deep that bond really extended. People began to look at each other, uncomfortable and terrified, trying to understand what was going on. The atmosphere in the church became increasingly heavy, and everyone's perplexed gaze seemed to say the same thing. Something inexplicable was happening. The priest, in an attempt to maintain control, approached the coffin. His steps were hesitant, almost faltering, as if he feared what he might discover. He knew he should open that coffin and see what was causing that noise, but he didn't want to face the truth. It wasn't just a question of respect for the dead, but a fear of what that revelation could mean for everyone present. The priest, trembling, took the key and, with a force he himself didn't know where it came from, slowly opened the coffin. What he found inside was more frightening than any prayer or rite of exorcism he knew. Inside the coffin, there wasn't just John's body. No, there was something else, a layer of earth carefully arranged over the body, and underneath it Max's skeleton, as if it were there to accompany its owner to the end. But what the priest's eyes couldn't immediately process, what it took him a few seconds to realize, was that Max wasn't completely buried. He was there, cradled, buried in such a way that his presence seemed somehow to be waiting, as if he were still alive. The priest took a step back, completely paralyzed by the sight. The bark, now clearer, was the snap that made him realize the terrifying truth. Max's body wasn't just being kept alive somehow. No, John, with his pain and obsession, had done something much more sinister. What lay before him was not a simple mourning ritual. It was a transgression of something far greater than any faith or doctrine. The bond between John and Max was not just one of love, but of a desperate attempt to bring the dog back to life. What was unfolding, there was not just a question of death and loss, but of an attempt to go against nature itself. The priest, unable to process what he had just discovered, felt his body tremble, and a muffled cry of horror escaped his lips. He knew then that what was happening there had no explanation. Something had been done beyond the limits of what human reason could comprehend. Something profound, which was now being revealed in the worst possible way. The moment the priest looked into the church and met the terrified eyes of those present, he understood that what was happening there was not just a transgression of faith. It was a rupture in the very laws of life and death. And at that moment, everyone knew nothing would ever be the same. The secret was out. Evil had been done. The silence in the church was deafening, but at the same time, a sense of relief hung in the air. It was as if everyone present had been through an experience so intense and profound that the mere fact of being there, facing something impossible to explain, left them with the feeling that they would never be able to return to normal life. The priest, with trembling hands, closed John's coffin and left him there, in peace, but also in a dark limbo where love and fear were irreversibly intertwined. The people, now more aware of what they were witnessing, began to leave one by one without saying a word, as if words simply couldn't make sense of what they had witnessed. There was no longer enough faith to explain what had happened. There was no longer any rational explanation that could cover what had unfolded before them. That story was marked forever, both for those who were there and for the priest himself, who would never be the same after that experience. Francisco, however, stood there, not knowing what to do. He had heard the stories about John's deep love for Max, but no one could ever have imagined how that love could be transformed into something that defied all the laws of life and death. As he looked at the coffin once more, he felt a weight on his chest. What could have made John follow this path? What could have driven that man to go so far, to completely ignore the limits of what was natural and acceptable, just to try to recover what life had taken from him? Was it a quest for redemption, or, in fact, an obsession that went beyond the limits of sanity? Francisco didn't know the answer. There was no way of knowing. But what remained was the result of that desperate attempt to defy the inevitable. The church, now silent, seemed to reflect the emptiness left when man stopped accepting death as something natural and turned his mourning into an act of pure irrationality. As he walked away from the church, still in shock, a question began to hammer itself into his mind. Was John really trying to revive Max? Or was he just unable to accept the loss of his loyal and faithful friend, whom he trusted more than anyone else? Can love, in its purest and most desperate form, drive us to do things we would never have imagined, even going beyond moral and spiritual limits? Perhaps John was moved by something that many of us have experienced, a love that knows no limits, that recognizes no barriers, and that sets us on a path of no return. But the price to pay for this was apparently too high. And while the town resumed its routine, the story of John and Max spread, becoming a legend that, like all great tragic stories, makes us reflect on what we are willing to sacrifice for those we love. As much as we try to avoid it, Love often brings us face to face with decisions that defy our reason, and the search for impossible solutions can lead us into an abyss we can no longer control. John and Max, in their story marked by grief and obsession, remind us that, in the end, we cannot fight against the forces that govern life and death, because any attempt to control them can have irreversible consequences. The real lesson here is not in trying to bring back what we have lost, but in learning to live with loss and accept that, even in the darkest moments, life goes on, with all its mysteries and the inevitability of its endings. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.